Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh and good day everyone. I am Abdul Rauf Ali Bakaraman Sampal and today I will be talking about expenditure cycle audit objectives, controls, and test of controls. So before anything else, let us first have a topic outline about my report. So the first part of this report is all about management assertions and the relationship between these management assertions and the expenditure cycle audit objectives. The second part is the input control, where we identify what are input controls and what are its substantive tests. Third part is the process controls, where we identify what are process controls and its substantive tests. Last part of my report is all about output control, in which we identify what are output controls and what are their respective substantive um, tests. So let us now proceed to the first part of my report. As we all know that in Chapter 1 introduced the concept of audit objectives na nagdederive from general management assertions about financial statement presentation. So these assertions are number 1, existence or occurrence, number 2, completeness or accuracy, number 3, rights and obligations, valuation or allocation, and presentation and disclosure. So um, let us first know what is the relationship between management assertions and expenditure cycle audit objectives. So here we have a table showing the relationship between management assertions and audit objectives. So first, management assertion, which is existence or occurrence. This verifies that the accounts payable balance represents amount actually owed by the organization at the balance sheet date. So, tinutukoy nito kung yung nasa balance ng accounts payable natin is totoong utang siya ng organization. Second one, establish that purchases transaction represent goods and services actually received during the period. So, tinutukoy niya kung meron ba talagang na-receive na goods and services during that period. And lastly, determine that payroll transactions represents wages for services actually performed during the period. So, tinutukoy din niya kung meron talagang na-perform na services during that period. So second assertion is the completeness. So this determines that the accounts payable represent all amounts owed by the organization for the purchases of goods and services as of the balance sheet date. So kumbaga yung tinutukoy dito sa completeness, from its word complete, tinutukoy lang niya kung complete ba talaga yung lahat ng, for example dito sa first, complete ba talaga na lahat ng amounts owed by the organization is nasa accounts payable. So, kumbaga, if nire-represent niya talaga. So, the second one is ensure that the financial statements reflect goods and services received by the organization less returned for the period. So, moving on to the next table. So, here we have the third assertion, which is the accuracy. So, ito naman sa accuracy, tinutukoy lang niya if accurate yung, for example, dito sa first, accurately computed and based on correct prices daw yung purchase transaction. So, kumbaga, nilalaman niya if accurate lang yung information. And the fourth assertion, which is rights and obligation, this established that the accounts payable and accrued payroll recorded at the balance sheet date are legal obligation of the organization. So, tinutukoy lang nito if legal tong obligations ng organization. So, moving on. So, moving on to the last pair of assertions, we have valuation or allocation. So, ito naman, verify niya that the accounts payable are stated at the correct amounts owed. So, tinutukoy niya kung correctly stated yung utang ng organization. Lastly, presentation and disclosure. This ensures that the accounts payable accrued payroll, and expenses reported for the period are properly described and classified in the financial statement. So basically, tinutukoy nito if correctly presented and disclosed yung information. So moving on to the second part of my report. So we have input controls. So ano nga ba itong mga input controls? So si input controls are designed to ensure that transactions are valid, accurate, and complete. Tandaan natin na control techniques vary considerably between batch and real-time systems. So the following input controls relate to expenditure cycle operations. So number one is data validation controls. Number two, batch controls. Number three, purchase authorization controls. And number four, employee authorization. So itong si input validation controls are intended to detect transcription errors in transaction data before they are processed. So since yung mga error na early na detect are less likely to infiltrate the accounting records, validation procedures are most effective when they are performed as close to the source of the transaction as possible. So sa batch systems, validation of purchase or validation of purchase orders occurs only after they have been sent to the vendor. So itong sistemang ito ay characterized by the need for extensive error correction and transaction resubmission procedures. While sa real-time system naman, uh, real-time system can identify and resolve most errors as they occur. Itong approach na to also minimizes human data entry and thus reducing the risk of data entry errors. So there are seven general types of validation tests. So number one is missing data checks. Number two is numeric alphabetic data checks. Number three, limit checks. Number four, range checks. And number five, validity checks. And number six, check digits. So dumako naman tayo sa seven or six general types of validation tests. So number one, we have missing data checks. Missing data checks are used to examine the contents of a field for the presence of blank spaces. So an employee number missing from an attendance record, the quantity received value missing from a receiving report may cause the transaction to be rejected. So when the validation program ay nakadetect ng blank space or missing data, where it expects to see a data value, the situation will be interpreted as an error. So if meron daw missing data, mag-error siya. So number two is numeric alphabetic data checks. So this determines whether the correct form of data is in a. So for example, the quantity field in a purchase order should not contain alphabetic data. So as with blanks, alphabetic data in a numeric field may cause serious processing errors. So number three, we have limit checks. So ano nga ba itong limit checks? So limit checks determines if the value in the field exceed an authorized limit. So as for its kumbaga derived from its root word which is limit, so naglilimit siya ng value. So for example, if the firm has a policy that no employee works more than 44 hours per week, the payroll system validation program can interrogate the hours worked field in the weekly payroll records for the value greater than 44. So next is range checks. Range checks assign upper and lower limits to acceptable data value. So this technique can be used to control orders placed with vendors. So the purpose of this control is to detect keystroke errors that shift the decimal point one or more places. It would not detect an error where a correct pay of, let's say, 9 pesos is incorrectly entered as 15 pesos. So next we have validity checks. So validity checks compare actual value in a field against known acceptable value. So So itong control na to ay ginagamit to verify such thing as state abbreviations or employee job skill codes. So if yung value in the field does not match one of the acceptable values, the record is determined to be an error. So lastly, we have check digit. So check digit identify keystroke errors in key field by testing their internal validity. A check digit could be used to verify a vendor number on a purchase order record. So moving on to the testing validation controls. So next we have the testing of validation controls. So data entry errors that slip through edit programs undetected can cause recorded accounts payable and expense amount to be materially misstated. So, pwede mali yung pagka-present or pagka-disclose or pagkasulat ng amounts. So, the following audit procedures provide evidence about the accuracy assertions. So, ang central audit issue natin dito is whether validation programs in the data editing system function correctly ba or have functioned as intended throughout the period. So, testing the logic of a validation program, however, represents a significant undertaking. So, mahirap siya gawin. So, or mahirap or tedious yung gawain natin. So, the auditor may decide to rely on the quality of other controls to provide the assurance needed to reduce the substantive testing. So, for example, pagkatapos ma-review yung systems development and maintenance controls, the auditor may determine that yung controls over the original program design are effective. So itong evidence na to permits the auditor to assess the risk of material program errors at low levels and make it more accurate. So, if yung control naman over system developments and maintenance are weak, the auditor may decide that the testing data editing controls will be more efficient than performing extensive substantive test of details. So, in such a case, the ITF or test data approach can enable the auditor to perform explicit test of the validation logic. So, itong testing would require the auditor to gain a familiarity with all the validation procedures in place. So, kailangan ni auditor na gumawa ng comprehensive set of test transaction which should include both valid and erroneous data value that fall within and outside the test parameters. So, pag na-analyze na ni auditor yung result, it will show the auditor the types of error if meron man na nakaka-bypass or nakaka-bypass undetected by the validation program. In addition to direct testing of program logic, the auditor can achieve some degree of assurance by reviewing error listings and error logs. So itong mga document na ito ay nagbibigay ng ebidensya to the effectiveness of the data entry process, the types and volumes of error encountered, and the manner in which the errors are corrected and re-entered into the system. So moving on, so, dumako naman tayo sa batch controls. So, batch controls are used to manage high volumes of transaction data through a system. So, ang objective ng batch control ay mag-reconcile ng output produced by the system with the input na originally entered into the system. So, batch control is initiated at the data input stage and continues throughout all phases of the data processing. So, the information contained in the transmittal sheet is entered as a separate control record that the system uses to verify the integrity of the batch. So, ang periodic reconciliation between yung data in the transmittal record at saka yung actual processing results provides assurance of the following. So, number one, lahat daw ng invoices na na-entered into the systems ay naproseso na. Second, walang invoice were processed and paid more than once. So, uh, once lang nabayaran yung mga invoices. And third, all invoices entered into the system are accounted for as either um, successfully processed or rejected dahil sa mga error. So, dumako naman tayo sa substantive test ng batch controls. So, the failure of batch controls to function properly can result in records being lost or processed multiple times. So, ang mga test ng batch controls ay nagbibigay sa auditor ng ebidensya na nagre-relate sa assertion ng completeness and accuracy. So, testing batch controls involves reviewing transmittal records of batches processed throughout the period at nire-reconcile siya sa batch control log. So, yung auditor ay kailangan niya i-investigate yung mga out of balance na condition to determine their cause. So by reviewing and reconciling transaction listings and error logs, the auditor should be able to obtain the answers to this question. So first, what caused this anomaly? Number two, did the system process one record twice due to a programming error? And number three, was an extra record entered into the system during the processing? And lastly, did the data entry clerk incorrectly calculate the batch control totals? So, next is, so dumako naman tayo sa purchases authorization controls. So, itong si purchases authorization occurs in the revenue cycle when goods are sold to the customers, while in the expenditure cycle, the purchase requisition file is sorted by the vendor number and purchases order are then prepared. So itong si Purchases Authorization Controls ay nagpo-prevent siya to make unnecessary and incorrect orders. So moving on to its substantive tests. So here we have the substantive test of purchases authorization controls. So incorrectly functioning purchase authorization controls can cause unnecessary and incorrect orders to be placed with vendors. So yeah, nasabi ko nga kanina. So the following test of controls provide evidence pertaining to the accuracy and valuation assertions. So, since yung mga purchase requisition natin ay internally generated, they should be free from clerical errors and do not need validating. However, may instances na yung computer logic errors in this procedure can cause negative operational and financial consequences that may go undetected. So, there are two issues in mind na importante. So, firstly, dapat ma-verify ng auditor na correct yung order quantity na ginamit before tayo gumawa ng or nung gumawa tayo ng requisition. So errors in programming logic or even in data entry may cause an incorrect order. So second, yung auditor should identify the inventory flagged as on order. So dapat before gumawa ng requisition or when a requisition is first prepared, dapat malaman natin yung on orders. So if di niya gawin ito, it may result in overinvestment in inventory dahil sa maraming orders of the same item at the same time. So moving on. So we are now in the employee authorization. So the personnel department prepares and submits personnel action forms to the payroll department. So these documents are used to effect changes in hourly pay rates, payroll deductions, and job classification. So simply put, itong document na ito ay nag-identify ng employees who are authorized to receive a salary or paycheck. So itong impormasyong nakukuha natin dito sa document na ito plays an important role in preventing errors at saka yung payroll fraud. An example of payroll fraud and error is yung mga ghost employees na alam naman natin na nangyayari until now. So, maaring merong name na wala naman siya, hindi naman siya nagtatrabaho pero tumatanggap pa rin ng sweldo. Another example is yung mga 'di ba sa public institutions, if you are late by let's say an hour or so na meron kang payroll deduction. So to prevent yung mga fraud, yung kumbaga kahit hindi nagtatrabaho ng ilang days ay nasusweldohan pa rin ng full, kailangan natin ng mga time cards para malaman natin kung merong payroll deductions ba or wala. So, when an employee authorization procedures are computerized, the payroll program matches each attendance record with a corresponding record in the current personal action file. So, any attendance record that do not match should be rejected and investigated by the management. So, dumako tayo sa substantive test ng employee authorization. So, failure to implement employee authorization procedures can result in payroll distribution to unauthorized individual. As in sa mga example ko kanina na yung mga ghost employee na tumatanggap pa rin ng sweldo kahit wala namang nagtatrabaho. So, the following test of control provide evidence pertaining to the existence, accuracy, valuation, and rights and obligation assertions. Kailangan ma-determine ni auditor that effective procedures exist in the personnel department para ma-identify yung mga current employees at ma-communicate nila yung mga status completely and correctly to the payroll function at saka monitor adherence to employee authorization procedures. So using either test data or integrated test facility or what we call ITF approaches, ma-assess ng auditor ang correctness of program procedures that validate employee authenticity. So the integrity of standing data is an important consideration in the preceding test. Hindi natin masasabi na kung correctly functioning ba yung payroll application ay correct na or malinis na yung payroll transaction. So a correctly functioning payroll application cannot successfully validate payroll transactions if the authorized employee file is itself invalid. So the auditor can obtain assurance that the file has integrity kung meron itong mga controls. So number one is access to authorized employee file is password control. So para kumbaga malaki yung security. So hindi basta lahat ng empleyado ay basta-basta nakaka-access. Number two is additions to and deletions from the file are restricted to authorized individuals in the personal department. So yun nga parang para secured yung what we call this employee file. And number three is the employee records stored on the file are encrypted, so more secured. So now let us move on to the process controls. So sa process controls naman ay nag-include ng computerized procedures for updating files and restricting access to data. So depending on the level of computer technology in place, process controls may include physical controls associated with manual activities. So there are two types of process controls, which is file update controls and access controls. So now let's proceed to file update controls. So run-to-run controls use batch control data discussed in the previous section to monitor the batch as it moves from one program procedure to another. So itong mga control na ito ay in-ensure niya na each run in the system processes both the batch correctly and completely. So after each major operation, key fields such as invoice amount and record counts are accumulated and compared to the corresponding values stored in the transmittal record. So a discrepancy may indicate that a record was either lost in processing, a record in the batch went unprocessed, or kung ang record ba ay processed more than once. So let's now move on to the types of file update controls. So first we have sequence check control. So in systems that use sequential master files, the order of the transaction records in the batch is critical to correct and complete processing. So as batch move through the process, it must be resorted in the order of the master file used in each run. So kailangan consistent yung order. An out-of-sequence supplier's invoice record in a batch will prevent other downstream record from being processed. So sequence check control needs to be in place para may compare sa sequence of each record in the batch with the previous record to ensure that proper sorting took place. So second one is liability validation control. So it is an important control in the purchases or accounts payable systems. So this process involves reconciling supporting documents including the purchase order, the receiving report, and the supplier's invoice. So kapag itong mga dokumentong ito ay mag-agree as to the items and quantities ordered and received, kumbaga kapag magtugma, and the prices charged must match the expected prices, then an account payable should be recognized and recorded. So third one is the valid vendor file. So this file consists of a list of vendors with whom the organization normally does business with. So medyo katulad din ito ng authorized employee file in which fraudulent transactions in the expenditure cycle often culminate in a payment to someone posing as a legitimate vendor. So bago magbayad, the recipient of the cash disbursement should be validated against the valid vendor file. So any record na hindi man tugma ay dapat i-reject at saka iimbestigahan ng management. So, dumako naman tayo sa testing file update controls. So, failure of file update controls to function properly may result in the following. So, number one is transaction may not be or transactions not being processed. So, in this case, liabilities are not recognized and recorded. Number two, transactions being processed incorrectly. In this case, payment are approved for unauthorized recipients. And lastly, transactions being posted to the wrong supplier's account. Test of file update controls provide the auditor with evidence relating to the management assertions of existence, completeness, rights and obligation, and accuracy. Checks can be performed by using either ITF or test data approach. So, si auditor gagawa siya ng test data na naglalaman ng records na out of sequence in the batch and verify that each was handled correctly. So, isa pa, yung auditor need niya i-verify yung mathematical correctness ng procedure. Next, testing the liability validation logic ay nagre-require ng pag-iintindi ng decision rule for matching supporting documents. By creating test purchase orders, receiving reports, and supplier invoices, the auditor can verify if yung decision rules are being correctly applied. Lastly, similar to the test of sequence checks, ITF and test data method ay maaaring magamit to test the effectiveness of the valid vendor control. So this involved creating a reference file for valid vendors and file of supplier invoices to be paid. So kapag merong invoice record na merong vendor number na hindi tugma sa isang valid vendor record, it should be rejected by the program at saka ipapas ito as an error for the management for management review. So moving on to the second type of process controls, we have access controls. So access controls prevent and detect unauthorized and illegal access to the firm's asset. Inventories and cash are the physical asset of the expenditure cycle. So traditional techniques used to limit access to these assets include number one, warehouse security such as fence, alarms, and guards. So number two, moving assets promptly from the receiving dock to the warehouse. And number 3, paying employees by check rather than cash. So dumako naman tayo sa access controls. So access control lies at the heart of accounting information integrity. So sa absence ng adequate controls, supplier invoices can be deleted, added, or even falsified. So individual payroll account balances can also be erased or the entire account payable file can be destroyed. So evidence gathered about the effectiveness of access controls test the management assertions of existence, completeness, accuracy, valuation and allocation, rights and obligation, and presentation and disclosure. So since yung payment sa mga false vendors ay uh, nagkikerry ng such potential for material loss, yung auditor is concerned about the integrity of the valid vendor file. By gaining access to the file, a computer criminal can place his or her name and pretend to be an authorized vendor. So dapat i-assess ng auditor ang adequacy of access controls na nagpoprotekta sa files. Kasama na dito or this include password controls, restricting access to authorized managers, and using data encryption to prevent the file contents from being read or changed. So now we are at the last part of my report, which is output controls. So, output controls are designed to ensure that information is not lost, misdirected, or even corrupted, and that system processes function as intended. So, output control can be designed to either identify operational and internal control problems. So one important element of output control is the maintenance of an audit trail. So details of transaction processing produced at intermediate points can provide an audit trail that reflects activity through every stage of operations. So the following are examples of audit trail output controls. So number 1 is accounts payable change report. Number 2, transaction logs. Number 3, transaction listing. Number 4, log of automatic transactions. Number 5, unique transaction identifiers. And lastly, error listing. So, firstly is the accounts payable change report. So, this document ay isang summary report na pinapakita yung overall change to the accounts payable. So, itong mga figure na to should be or should reconcile with the total vendor invoices received, total cash disbursement, at saka yung general ledger. So, number 2 is transaction logs. So, this serves as a journal where every transaction successfully processed should be recorded too. So, transaction rejected because of input errors should be placed in an error file. Tapos, i-correct siya at saka i-re-submit. So, the transaction log and error files together thus account for all economic activity. So third one is the transaction listing. So this listing is where all successful transactions are listed in. So listings should go to the appropriate users to facilitate reconciliation with input. So next is the log of automatic transactions. So to maintain audit trails, all internally generated transactions must be placed in a transition log and a listing of these transactions should be sent to the appropriate manager for review. So next is unique transaction identifiers. So each transaction processed by the system must be uniquely identified with a transaction number. So this feature is the only practical means of tracing a particular transaction through a database of thousands or even millions of records. So madami siyang records. So in systems that use physical purchase orders, the unique number printed on the document can be transcribed during the data input and used for this purpose. While in real-time systems that do not use source document, Each purchase order should be assigned by a unique number by the system. So lastly, we have error listing. So itong error listing ay isang listing of all error records which should go to the appropriate users to support error correction and resubmission. So testing output controls. So the absence of adequate output controls has adverse implication for operational efficiency and financial reporting. So ang ebidensya na nakalap natin through test of output controls relates to the completeness and accuracy assertions. So testing output controls involves reviewing summary reports for accuracy, completeness, timeliness, and relevance to the decision that they are intended to support. Additionally, the auditor should trace sample transactions through audit trail reports. So, tandaan natin, importante yung audit trail. So, including transaction listings, error logs, and logs of resubmitted records. So, um, in modern systems, audit trails are usually stored on stored online as text files that can be read by word processing, such as spreadsheet programs. So ACLs are capable of searching log files for specific records to verify completeness and accuracy. So pwede din naman gumamit ng ITF ang auditor. A well-designed ITF system will permit the auditor to produce a batch of sample transactions, so including some error records, and trace them through all phases of processing, error detection, at saka audit or output reporting. So, so that is all. Thank you for watching.